The church bell of Cedar Ridge was ringing its evening call to prayer when Jack Sullivan rode into town after 10 years of running from the law. His horse's hooves echoed through the dusty main street as he passed familiar buildings that had grown older and more weathered, just like the wanted posters bearing his face that still hung in the sheriff's office window. Jack pulled his hat low over his eyes and tried to ignore the stares from townspeople who seemed to recognize something familiar about the stranger in their midst. 10 years, 10 long years since he had fled Cedar Ridge with blood on his hands and a price on his head. Jack had been 19 then, angry and reckless, leading a gang of outlaws who robbed banks and stages across 3 territories. Now he was 29, scarred by bullets and hardened by a decade of looking over his shoulder, but something had changed inside him during those years on the run. The anger had slowly transformed into something else: regret, loneliness, and a desperate desire to find some kind of peace before it was too late. What brought Jack back to Cedar Ridge wasn't nostalgia or homesickness. It was a letter that had found him 3 weeks ago in a saloon in Dodge City, a letter written in handwriting he recognized despite the years that had passed. The letter was from his younger brother Daniel, and it contained news that had shaken Jack to his core. Their father was dead, buried 6 months ago, and Daniel had become the town preacher. Daniel Sullivan, the sweet-natured boy who used to follow Jack around like a lost puppy, was now Reverend Sullivan, spiritual leader of the same community that Jack had terrorized in his youth. As Jack rode slowly down Main Street, he could see the church at the far end of town, its white steeple reaching toward the darkening sky like a finger pointing toward heaven. Or perhaps, Jack thought grimly, pointing toward judgment. He had come back to Cedar Ridge with no clear plan, driven only by a need to see his brother one more time, and perhaps to find some kind of absolution for the sins that had been weighing on his soul for a decade. The church was larger than Jack remembered, with fresh paint and new windows that glowed warmly in the evening light. As he approached, he could hear singing from inside, voices raised in harmony that spoke of faith and community, and all the things that Jack had lost when he chose the outlaw's path. He dismounted his horse and stood for a long moment outside the church doors, listening to the hymn, and wondering if he had the courage to face what waited inside. When Jack finally pushed open the church doors, the singing stopped abruptly. 30 pairs of eyes turned to stare at the rough-looking stranger who had interrupted their evening service. Jack's own eyes were fixed on the pulpit, where a man in clerical robes stood with a Bible in his hands and shock written across his face. Daniel Sullivan had grown from a gangly teenager into a dignified man of God, but his eyes were the same gentle brown that Jack remembered, and they were filled with a mixture of joy and terror as he recognized his outlaw brother standing in the doorway of his church. For a long moment, neither brother moved. The congregation sat in tense silence, sensing that something significant was happening but not understanding what. Then Daniel set down his Bible and walked slowly down the aisle toward Jack, his footsteps echoing in the hushed sanctuary. When he reached his brother, Daniel did something that surprised everyone present, including Jack himself. He embraced the notorious outlaw in front of his entire congregation, tears streaming down his face as he whispered, "Welcome home, Jack." "Welcome home." The reaction from the congregation was immediate and mixed. Some people gasped in shock as they realized who the stranger was. Others began whispering urgently to their neighbors, spreading the news that Jack Sullivan, the bank robber whose gang had terrorized the territory for years, was standing in their church. A few families quickly gathered their children and headed for the exits, unwilling to remain in the same building as a known killer. But others stayed, watching with fascination and growing unease as the preacher continued to embrace his outlaw brother. Daniel quickly ended the service with a brief prayer and asked his congregation to go in peace, all while keeping one protective arm around Jack's shoulders. As the church emptied, with many parishioners casting worried glances back at the Sullivan brothers, Daniel led Jack into the small office behind the pulpit. It was there, in the privacy of the pastor's study, that the two brothers finally had their first real conversation in 10 years. "You shouldn't have come here," Daniel said, but his voice held no anger, only concern. "There's still a bounty on your head, Jack. Sheriff Morrison has been looking for you for years." Jack nodded grimly. He knew the risks of returning to Cedar Ridge, but he had reached a point in his life where the need for connection outweighed the fear of capture. "I got your letter about Pa," Jack said quietly. "I know I should have been here when he died. I know I failed him, just like I failed everyone else who ever cared about me." Daniel studied his brother's face, seeing the lines of weariness and regret that hadn't been there 10 years ago. The Jack who had left Cedar Ridge had been full of anger and defiance. The Jack who had returned seemed broken and lost, searching for something he couldn't quite name. "Pa forgave you before he died," Daniel said gently. "He never stopped believing that you would find your way back to the right path. And I never stopped praying for you, even when everyone else gave up hope." Jack felt something crack inside his chest at his brother's words. He had spent 10 years convincing himself that he was beyond redemption, that the choices he had made had permanently severed his connection to anything good and decent in the world. Daniel made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "You can stay here," he said. "In the church. I have a small room in the back where I keep supplies. It's not much, but it's safe, and you'll have time to figure out what you want to do next." Jack stared at his brother in amazement. "Daniel, if people find out you're harboring me, it could destroy everything you've built here. Your reputation, your ministry, your whole life." "Maybe," Daniel replied with a calm that came from deep faith. "But I believe in redemption, Jack. I believe that no one is too far gone to find their way back to grace. And if I can't show that kind of mercy to my own brother, then what kind of preacher am I?" It was a risk that Daniel was willing to take, but he had no idea how severely that decision would be tested in the days to come. That night, Jack lay on a simple cot in the small storage room behind the church altar, staring up at the ceiling and listening to the wind whistling through the eaves. For the first time in 10 years he felt something approaching peace. He was still a wanted man, still in danger of capture and hanging, but he was also home in a way he hadn't been since he was 19 years old. His brother had offered him sanctuary not because Jack deserved it, but because Daniel believed in the possibility of redemption. But Jack's presence in Cedar Ridge could not remain secret for long. Small towns have a way of magnifying whispers into shouts, and by the next morning, word had spread throughout the community that the preacher was hiding his outlaw brother in the church. The reaction was swift and divided. Some members of Daniel's congregation were scandalized, demanding that he turn Jack over to the authorities immediately. Others were curious about this dramatic example of Christian forgiveness playing out in their own community. Sheriff Tom Morrison, a weathered man in his 50s, who had been hunting Jack Sullivan for years, arrived at the church before noon with a warrant and 2 deputies. Daniel met them at the front door, standing calmly in their path with his hands clasped behind his back. "Good morning, Sheriff," Daniel said politely. "What can I do for you?" Morrison held up the warrant. "I have reliable information that you're harboring a known fugitive, Reverend. Jack Sullivan is wanted for bank robbery, cattle rustling and murder in 3 territories." "I'm aware of my brother's reputation," Daniel replied evenly. "But I'm also aware that every person deserves a chance at redemption." Sheriff Morrison had known Daniel since he was a boy, and he respected the young preacher's commitment to his faith. But he also had a job to do, and Jack Sullivan represented the kind of dangerous criminal who couldn't be allowed to remain free simply because he had a brother in the clergy. "Daniel, I understand your feelings about family," Morrison said, "but Jack has blood on his hands. Good people have died because of him. I can't just look the other way because he's your brother." Daniel nodded slowly, understanding the sheriff's position but unwilling to abandon his own principles. "I'm not asking you to look the other way, Sheriff. I'm asking you to give him a chance to prove that people can change." The standoff at the church drew a crowd of townspeople, all eager to see how this drama would unfold. Some supported the sheriff's position that Jack should be arrested immediately. Others were moved by Daniel's demonstration of faith and forgiveness. The tension in the air was palpable as two different concepts of justice faced each other on the steps of the church. It was Jack himself who broke the stalemate. He emerged from the church and walked slowly toward the sheriff, his hands visible and empty. "Sheriff Morrison," Jack said in a voice that carried clearly to the gathered crowd. "I understand you have a warrant for my arrest." Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but Jack made no threatening moves. Instead, he did something that surprised everyone present. "I'm not going to run anymore," Jack announced to the crowd. "I've spent 10 years running from what I did, and it hasn't brought me any peace. My brother has shown me that there might be another way to live, a way that doesn't involve hurting people or taking what doesn't belong to me." The crowd murmured with interest and surprise. This was not the defiant outlaw they had expected to see. Jack continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I know I can't undo the harm I've caused. I know that some of you have suffered because of my actions, and I know that I have to face justice for what I've done. But I'm asking for the chance to prove that I'm not the same man who left this town 10 years ago." Sheriff Morrison studied Jack's face, looking for signs of deception or desperation. What he saw instead was something he hadn't expected: genuine remorse and a willingness to accept responsibility. "Are you surrendering yourself, Jack?" Morrison asked. Jack glanced back at his brother, who gave him an encouraging nod. "I'm asking for a chance to make things right," Jack replied. "I want to return the money I stole, work to repair the damage I caused, and prove that redemption is possible. But I understand if you can't allow that." It was an unprecedented situation for Sheriff Morrison, and for the community of Cedar Ridge. Daniel stepped forward and placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. "Sheriff, I'm willing to take responsibility for Jack's actions while he's in town. I'll guarantee his presence for any legal proceedings, and I'll personally ensure that he doesn't cause any trouble. All I'm asking for is a chance to show that the Christian principles we talk about on Sunday can work in the real world." The crowd waited in tense silence for Morrison's decision. After what seemed like an eternity, Sheriff Morrison made a choice that would be debated in Cedar Ridge for years to come. "I'm going to give you 1 month," he said to Jack. 1 month to prove that you've changed, to make whatever amends you can, and to show this community that you're serious about redemption. But you'll be under house arrest at the church. You'll report to me every day, and if you cause even the smallest amount of trouble, I'll arrest you immediately." It was more than Jack had dared to hope for. The month that followed tested everyone involved in ways they hadn't anticipated. Jack threw himself into the work of making amends with an intensity that surprised even Daniel. He spent his days doing manual labor around the church and town, repairing buildings, helping elderly residents with chores, and working to pay back some of the money he had stolen over the years. He refused any payment for his work, insisting that it was the least he could do to begin making up for his past crimes. But Jack's presence in Cedar Ridge also created divisions in the community that ran deeper than anyone had expected. Some families stopped attending church services, uncomfortable with worshiping in the same building where a known killer was sleeping. Other parishioners rallied around Daniel's demonstration of Christian forgiveness, seeing it as a powerful example of faith in action. The town found itself split between those who believed in redemption and those who believed that some crimes were unforgivable. The real test of Jack's transformation came 3 weeks into his month of probation, when his old gang arrived in Cedar Ridge, looking for him. The Sullivan gang, now led by a vicious outlaw named Black Pete Morrison, had heard rumors that Jack was hiding in his hometown, and they had come to bring him back into the fold. Black Pete was Sheriff Morrison's younger brother, a fact that added another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. When Black Pete and 5 other heavily armed outlaws rode into Cedar Ridge, their intentions were clear. They wanted Jack to rejoin the gang for one last big score, a bank robbery that would set them all up for life. If Jack refused, they were prepared to use force to convince him. The confrontation took place in front of the church, with much of the town watching from windows and doorways, afraid to venture outside while armed outlaws were in the streets. "Jack Sullivan," Black Pete called out, his voice carrying clearly through the still air. "I know you're in there. Time to stop playing preacher and get back to business. Jack emerged from the church alone, despite Daniel's pleas that he stay inside and let the sheriff handle the situation. Jack walked slowly toward his former associates, and for a moment, it looked like he might be reconsidering his commitment to redemption. But when Jack spoke, his words made his position clear to everyone present. "I'm not going back, Pete," he said firmly. "I'm done with that life. Find yourself another partner." Black Pete laughed harshly. "You think you can just walk away from us? You think hiding in a church makes you some kind of saint? You're a killer, Jack, just like the rest of us. That's what you'll always be." The confrontation escalated quickly when Black Pete drew his gun and pointed it directly at Jack's chest. "You're coming with us," he snarled, "or you're not leaving here alive." It was at that moment that Sheriff Morrison arrived with his deputies, creating a tense standoff between law enforcement and the outlaws. But before anyone could fire a shot, Jack made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Instead of reaching for his own gun, Jack stepped between the sheriff and his former gang members, putting himself directly in the line of fire. "Nobody needs to die here today," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Pete, you want me to prove I'm still one of you? Then let these people be. Your fight is with me, not with this town." It was an act of selfless courage that surprised everyone present, including Jack himself. Black Pete hesitated for a moment, confused by Jack's unexpected response. In that moment of uncertainty, Sheriff Morrison and his deputies were able to surround the outlaws and disarm them without bloodshed. The Sullivan gang was arrested and taken to jail, but not before Black Pete delivered a parting threat that chilled everyone who heard it. "This isn't over, Jack," Black Pete snarled as he was led away in handcuffs. "You can't escape what you are. Sooner or later you'll remember that you're one of us, and when you do, we'll be waiting." The threat hung in the air like a dark cloud, reminding everyone that Jack's past was not easily left behind. In the aftermath of the confrontation, public opinion in Cedar Ridge began to shift in Jack's favor. His willingness to risk his own life to protect the town had impressed even some of his harshest critics. But the real transformation in how people viewed Jack came a few days later, when 8-year-old Emma Watson went missing in the woods outside town. Emma was the daughter of Tom Watson, one of the town council members who had been most vocal in opposing Jack's presence in Cedar Ridge. When the little girl disappeared during a family picnic, a search party was quickly organized. Jack asked Sheriff Morrison for permission to join the search, and after some hesitation, Morrison agreed, recognizing that Jack's skills as a tracker might be valuable in finding the missing child. For 2 days, search parties combed the dense forests and rocky canyons around Cedar Ridge, but found no trace of Emma Watson. The girl's parents were frantic with worry, and the entire community was gripped by fear. It was Jack who finally found the crucial clue that led to Emma's rescue. Using tracking skills he had learned during his years as an outlaw, he discovered a small piece of fabric caught on a tree branch near a treacherous ravine. Following the trail with the patience and expertise of an experienced tracker, Jack eventually found Emma trapped on a narrow ledge halfway down the ravine wall. The little girl had fallen while exploring and had been unable to climb back up or call for help loud enough to be heard by the search parties. She was cold, frightened, and dehydrated, but alive. The rescue was dangerous and required all of Jack's skills as a climber and his knowledge of ropes and mountaineering techniques. As word spread that the missing girl had been found, crowds gathered at the top of the ravine to watch the dramatic rescue unfold. Jack spent more than an hour carefully making his way down to Emma's position, talking to her gently to keep her calm, and reassuring her that everything would be all right. When Jack finally emerged from the ravine carrying Emma safely in his arms, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Tom Watson, the man who had been one of Jack's fiercest critics, was waiting at the top with tears streaming down his face. As Jack handed Emma to her father, Watson gripped the former outlaw's hand and whispered, "Thank you, I'll never forget what you've done." The rescue of Emma Watson became a turning point in how Cedar Ridge viewed Jack Sullivan. Stories of his skill, courage, and gentleness during the rescue spread throughout the community, replacing the tales of his criminal past with evidence of his transformation. Children who had been afraid of the dangerous outlaw began to see him as a hero who had saved one of their own. But Jack's greatest challenge was yet to come. On the last day of his month of probation, as Sheriff Morrison was preparing to make a final decision about Jack's future, a telegram arrived that changed everything. The message was from the territorial marshal, informing Morrison that Jack Sullivan was wanted for questioning in connection with a recent bank robbery in Silver Creek, 200 miles away. The robbery had taken place just 2 weeks earlier, while Jack was in Cedar Ridge under Sheriff Morrison's supervision. It should have been impossible for Jack to be involved, but the witnesses had described a man who looked exactly like him, and the robbery had been carried out using techniques that were characteristic of the Sullivan gang. Either Jack had somehow left Cedar Ridge without being detected, or someone was impersonating him. The accusation threw the entire community into turmoil. Those who had come to believe in Jack's redemption felt betrayed and foolish. Those who had never trusted him felt vindicated in their suspicions. Daniel was devastated by the possibility that his brother might have been deceiving him all along, while Jack himself was stunned by the accusation and desperate to prove his innocence. Sheriff Morrison found himself in an impossible position. He had vouched for Jack's character, and had allowed him to remain free based on his apparent transformation. If Jack was guilty of this new crime, Morrison's judgment would be called into question, and his career would be ruined. But if Jack was innocent, then someone was going to great lengths to frame him and destroy the fragile redemption he had worked so hard to achieve. The truth, when it finally emerged, was more complex than anyone had imagined. The Silver Creek robbery had indeed been carried out by someone who looked exactly like Jack Sullivan, but it wasn't Jack himself. It was his cousin Marcus Sullivan, a member of the extended Sullivan family who bore a striking resemblance to Jack, and who had been using that resemblance to his advantage for years. Marcus had been impersonating Jack during robberies across the territory, knowing that any witnesses would identify the crimes with the more famous outlaw. When Marcus learned that Jack was in Cedar Ridge trying to go straight, he saw an opportunity to pull off one more big score while ensuring that Jack would be blamed for it. It was a diabolical plan that nearly succeeded. The truth came to light when Marcus was captured during another robbery attempt and confessed to impersonating his cousin. A telegram with the confession arrived in Cedar Ridge just hours before Sheriff Morrison was planning to arrest Jack. The vindication was complete and dramatic, but the damage to Jack's reputation and to the community's trust had already been done. In the aftermath of his vindication, Jack faced a difficult decision. He could stay in Cedar Ridge and continue trying to rebuild his life, but he would always be viewed with suspicion by some members of the community. Or he could leave town and start over somewhere else, where his past wouldn't follow him. It was Daniel who provided the guidance Jack needed to make his choice. "Redemption isn't a destination," Daniel told his brother as they sat together in the church sanctuary one evening. "It's a journey that lasts your whole life. Whether you stay here or go somewhere else, you'll still be the same person with the same choices to make every day. The question isn't where you go, but who you choose to be wherever you are." Jack's decision surprised everyone, including himself. He chose to stay in Cedar Ridge, not because it was easy, but because it was where he had learned the most important lesson of his life: that people can change, that redemption is possible, and that the love of family and community can overcome even the darkest past. He asked Sheriff Morrison for a job as a deputy, offering to use his knowledge of criminal techniques to help protect the community he had once terrorized. Sheriff Morrison's decision to hire Jack as a deputy was controversial, but it proved to be inspired. Jack's understanding of how outlaws thought and operated made him invaluable in preventing crimes and tracking down criminals. His transformation from outlaw to lawman became a legend throughout the territory, inspiring other wanted men to believe that redemption was possible for them as well. Years later, as Jack Sullivan pinned his deputy's badge to his vest each morning, he would remember the words his brother had spoken on that first night in the church. "I believe in redemption, Jack. I believe that no one is too far gone to find their way back to grace." Those words had saved Jack's life and given him a future he never could have imagined during his years as an outlaw. Daniel's ministry grew stronger as well, as his demonstration of faith in action attracted people from across the territory who wanted to be part of a community that believed in second chances. The church in Cedar Ridge became known as a place where anyone could find forgiveness and a new beginning, regardless of their past. The relationship between the Sullivan brothers deepened into something stronger than family bonds. They became partners in the work of redemption, Daniel offering spiritual guidance while Jack provided practical protection for those seeking to escape their criminal pasts. Together they created a model for how communities could balance justice with mercy, punishment with forgiveness. Jack never completely escaped his past. There were always those who remembered his crimes and viewed him with suspicion, but he had learned that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about creating a better future. Every day he chose to be a protector instead of a predator, a builder instead of a destroyer, a man of peace instead of a man of violence. The story of the Sullivan brothers became a testament to the power of faith, family, and second chances. It proved that no one is beyond redemption if they are willing to do the hard work of changing their life and if they have people who believe in their capacity for good. In a world that often seemed divided between the righteous and the damned, Jack and Daniel Sullivan showed that the line between the two was not as fixed as people wanted to believe. The impact of Jack's transformation extended far beyond Cedar Ridge. News of the outlaw who became a deputy sheriff spread throughout the territory, inspiring other communities to reconsider their approaches to crime and punishment. Several towns began implementing programs that offered redemption opportunities to wanted men who were willing to surrender and make amends for their crimes. Jack became a mentor to other former outlaws who sought to change their lives. His unique understanding of criminal psychology, combined with his personal experience of transformation, made him particularly effective at reaching men who had given up hope of ever living an honest life. He established what became known as the Cedar Ridge program, a structured approach to helping former criminals integrate into law-abiding society. The program required participants to make full confessions of their crimes, work to make financial restitution to their victims, and commit to a year of supervised community service. Most importantly, each participant was paired with a mentor from the community who would provide guidance and support during the difficult transition from criminal to citizen. The success rate was remarkable, with more than 70% of participants successfully completing the program and going on to lead productive lives. Daniel's role in the program was equally crucial. He provided spiritual counseling to participants and their families, helping them process the guilt and shame that often accompanied attempts at redemption. His sermons about second chances and the possibility of transformation attracted visitors from across the territory, and many churches began adopting similar approaches to community outreach and criminal rehabilitation. The partnership between the Sullivan brothers also led to innovations in law enforcement that were ahead of their time. Jack advocated for what would later be called community policing, the idea that preventing crime was more effective than simply punishing it after the fact. He worked with local businesses, schools, and families to identify and address the conditions that led young men to choose criminal paths. One of Jack's most successful initiatives was the establishment of work programs for at-risk youth. Young men who might otherwise have been tempted by the outlaw life were given opportunities to earn honest wages through construction projects, ranch work, and other manual labor. Jack personally supervised many of these programs, sharing his own story as a cautionary tale about the consequences of choosing crime over honest work. The relationship between Jack and Sheriff Morrison evolved into one of the most effective law enforcement partnerships in the territory. Morrison's experience and institutional knowledge combined with Jack's insight into criminal behavior created a formidable team that significantly reduced crime rates throughout the region. Their success attracted attention from territorial authorities, who began consulting with them on law enforcement policy for the entire region. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of Jack's redemption was its effect on the families of his victims. Initially, many of these families were outraged by Jack's apparent escape from punishment and his acceptance into the community. However, as Jack began personally reaching out to make amends, several remarkable reconciliations took place. One of the most powerful examples involved the family of Robert Hayes, a bank clerk who had been killed during one of Jack's robberies 8 years earlier. Hayes had left behind a widow and 3 young children who had struggled financially ever since his death. When Jack learned of their situation, he approached Mrs. Hayes and offered to work without pay to support her family until her children were old enough to support themselves. Initially, Mrs. Hayes was furious at what she saw as an insulting gesture from her husband's killer. But Jack's persistence and genuine remorse eventually wore down her resistance. Over the course of several months, as Jack proved his commitment by working dawn to dusk on the Hayes farm and turning over every penny he earned to the family, Mrs. Hayes began to see him not as a monster but as a broken man trying to find his way back to humanity. The transformation in their relationship became a powerful symbol of the possibility of forgiveness and healing. Mrs. Hayes eventually became one of Jack's strongest supporters, testifying before territorial officials about the genuineness of his change and advocating for the expansion of redemption programs to other communities. Her forgiveness didn't erase the pain of her husband's death, but it demonstrated that even the most grievous wounds could begin to heal when met with genuine repentance and sustained effort to make amends. Jack's work with the Hayes family also led to broader discussions about the responsibility of former criminals to their victims' families. He advocated for laws requiring outlaws who sought pardons or reduced sentences to provide ongoing support to the families of their victims. This concept, revolutionary for its time, eventually influenced territorial and state legislation regarding criminal restitution. The success of the Cedar Ridge approach to criminal rehabilitation attracted the attention of religious leaders, social reformers, and government officials from across the country. Delegations began arriving in the small town to study the Sullivan brothers' methods and to interview both Jack and the community members who had been affected by his transformation. One of the most significant visitors was Judge Samuel Crawford, a federal judge known for his harsh sentences and skeptical attitude toward criminal rehabilitation. Crawford arrived in Cedar Ridge expecting to debunk what he saw as misguided sentimentality about criminal reform. Instead, he spent 2 weeks interviewing Jack, Daniel, Sheriff Morrison, and dozens of community members, gradually becoming convinced that genuine transformation was not only possible but could be systematically encouraged. Judge Crawford returned to his circuit court with a new approach to sentencing that incorporated elements of the Cedar Ridge program. Instead of simply imposing prison terms or death sentences, he began offering certain defendants the opportunity to participate in supervised rehabilitation programs. His courtroom became a laboratory for testing new approaches to criminal justice that balanced punishment with the possibility of redemption. The influence of Jack's story spread even further when Daniel began writing about their experiences for religious publications. His articles about faith-based approaches to criminal rehabilitation were reprinted in newspapers and magazines across the country, sparking debates about the nature of justice, the possibility of redemption, and the role of communities in addressing crime. These writings eventually led to the publication of Daniel's book, The Outlaw's Gospel, a story of faith, family, and second chances. The book became a bestseller and established Daniel as a leading voice in the movement for criminal justice reform. He was invited to speak at churches, universities, and government conferences, spreading the message that redemption was possible for even the most hardened criminals, if communities were willing to offer genuine opportunities for transformation. Jack, meanwhile, was reluctant to seek publicity for his story, preferring to focus on the practical work of law enforcement and rehabilitation. However, he eventually agreed to share his experiences when he realized that his testimony could help other former outlaws who were struggling to find acceptance in their communities. His speaking engagements, always conducted alongside Daniel, provided powerful first-hand accounts of the challenges and rewards of choosing redemption over continued criminality. The Sullivan brothers' influence on criminal justice reform extended well into the 20th century. Their emphasis on community-based rehabilitation, victim restitution, and the integration of spiritual counseling into law enforcement became foundational principles for progressive approaches to criminal justice. Many of the reforms they pioneered were eventually adopted by state and federal authorities, fundamentally changing how society approached the problems of crime and punishment. But beyond their impact on policy and institutions, the story of Jack and Daniel Sullivan became a source of hope for countless individuals who had given up on the possibility of changing their lives. Letters poured in from across the country from former criminals, their families, and community members who had been inspired by their example to believe in the possibility of redemption. One particularly moving letter came from a woman in California whose son had been executed for murder just months before she learned about Jack's story. She wrote to Daniel expressing her belief that her son could have been saved if he had encountered the kind of community support and redemption opportunity that Jack had found in Cedar Ridge. Her letter prompted Daniel to establish a fund to support families dealing with the criminal justice system, providing resources for both rehabilitation and victim support. The Cedar Ridge approach also influenced the development of what would later be called restorative justice, a philosophy that emphasizes healing and reconciliation over punishment. Jack's work with victim families demonstrated that meaningful encounters between criminals and those they had harmed could lead to powerful healing for both parties. This insight eventually informed legal and social work practices that are still used today. As Jack aged, he never lost his sense of gratitude for the second chance he had been given. In his later years, he often spoke about the moment when Daniel had embraced him in the church sanctuary as the turning point of his life. That simple act of unconditional love and acceptance had broken through years of hardened cynicism and opened the door to transformation. The church in Cedar Ridge became a pilgrimage site for people seeking their own second chances. Visitors came from across the country to see where the famous redemption had taken place, and to seek guidance from the Sullivan brothers about their own struggles with guilt, addiction, and criminal behavior. Daniel and Jack never turned anyone away, offering counseling, practical assistance, and most importantly, the message that no one was beyond the reach of grace. When Jack finally died at the age of 73, the entire territory mourned the loss of a man who had become a symbol of the possibility of transformation. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including former outlaws who had followed his example, law enforcement officers who had worked with him, and family members of victims who had found healing through his efforts at reconciliation. Daniel's eulogy for his brother captured the essence of Jack's legacy. "My brother Jack proved that a man is not defined by his worst moments, but by his willingness to do better. He showed us that redemption is not a single event, but a daily choice to serve others rather than ourselves, to build rather than destroy, to love rather than hate." His life reminds us that grace is always available to those who seek it, and that forgiveness is always possible for those who offer it. The story of the Sullivan brothers continued to inspire long after both men were gone. Their approach to criminal justice reform influenced generations of legal scholars, social workers, and religious leaders. The principles they established, that punishment should be balanced with opportunities for redemption, that communities bear responsibility for both creating and solving crime problems, and that no individual is beyond the possibility of transformation, became cornerstones of progressive criminal justice philosophy. Today, the church in Cedar Ridge still stands as a monument to the power of faith, family, and second chances. The plaque by the front door, installed by the community after Daniel's death, reads, "No one is too far gone to find their way back to grace." Visitors continue to come from around the world to learn about the Sullivan brothers and to find inspiration for their own journeys toward redemption. Their legacy serves as a reminder that in a world often divided between the righteous and the damned, the line between the two is not as fixed as people want to believe. Jack and Daniel Sullivan proved that with faith, love, and community support, even the most hardened criminal can become a force for good in the world. Their story remains a testament to the transformative power of redemption and the endless possibilities that open up when people choose to believe in second chances.